Freedom Fest 2011 with Michael Shermer. Mr. Shermer is the author of The Believing Brain, and he talks about how irrational beliefs are formed and reinforced. This is about 50 minutes.
Well, good morning. I am Michael Shermer, the director of the Skeptic Society and the publisher of Skeptic Magazine. I think we actually have a slide of that. There we go. We are the quarterly publication of the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization devoted to investigating claims of the paranormal, pseudoscience, fringe groups and cults and claims of all kinds between good science, junk science, bad science, voodoo science, pathological science, non-science, and plain old nonsense. And unless you've been abducted by aliens and been on Mars, you know there's a lot of it out there. Nonsense, that is. Some people call us debunkers, but let's face it, there's a lot of bunk. And somebody's got to debunk it, and that's part of our job. More interesting to me is why people believe bunk. That is, why people believe weird things, which was the title of my first book, and this, my 10th book, The Believing Brain, is interested in why people believe anything at all, not just weird things. So I would invite you all to go to skeptic.com and subscribe to Skeptic Magazine, join the society. We believe in not just a free, but also a rational society, a society based on science. We live in the age of science, and that's our best tool for understanding how the world works, which is where I'm going with this short talk, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after a little while when I tell you about the book. I should note that on Monday I did the Colbert Report, so I thought I'd just tell you a little moment about that, because people are constantly asking me what was it like to do the show. Is he always in character? Yes, he's always in character. Even the obligatory author, guest host shot there, he's still in character. The show is filmed in New York. It's near where Jon Stewart's filmed. They're both comedy shows. These are the two most popular shows for authors to do. You will sell more books on either of these shows than you will on any other show except Oprah, but she's gone now. So, and in fact, the viewership from age 18 to 35 is greater than for Colbert or Stewart than it is for Jay Leno for that age group. In fact, there is something called the Colbert Bump that they call the Colbert Bump for your book sales, and it's hard to track immediately with actual cash register ka-chings in bookstores, but on Amazon.com my book went from number 578 to number 19 in a matter of a couple hours after doing the show. So it actually works. These are comedy shows. And so first and foremost, they tell the guest in the pre-interview, don't try to be funny. Leave that to the professionals. And I think that's actually good advice, because these guys really are funny. They're very fast. They're very facile and quick. And they have a team of 15 full-time comedy writers that sit there all day, every day, writing bits and lines that you would be foolish to try to compete with. And so, it's just try to get your message across and get the point across. So that's what I did. So basically, The Believing Brain starts off with a thought experiment. So imagine you're a hominid on the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago. And your name is Lucy, the little Lucy. Thank you for that. Not everybody always gets that little joke. It doesn't play well in the Midwest. 3.5 million years ago, the earth was created 6,000 years ago. Right after the Babylonians invented beer. Yeah, that's about right. Anyway, so you're a hominid. Actually, that reminds me of that Gary Larson cartoon with the little Australopithecines in the cave party, and the guy's looking at the girl and going, "You're not the Lucy." It's kind of a funny bit. So you're a hominid on the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago, and you hear a rustle in the grass. Is it a dangerous predator, or is it just the wind? Well, if you assume that it's a dangerous predator, and it turns out it's just the wind, you've made a type 1 error in cognition, a false positive. You connected A to B, but A is not really connected to B. It's just an accidental correlation there. There's no causal connection. But that's not a particularly high-cost error to make. Lots of animals make them. You just become more skittish and cautious, and you move around the noise, and you've all seen how animals are like that in these fur, fin, and feather shows on the Science Channel, Nature Channel, History Channel, Learning Channel, and so on, where they're super skittish, particularly preyed upon animals. On the other hand, and the reason for that is because, on the other hand, if you assume the rustle in the grass is just the wind, and it turns out it's a dangerous predator, you're lunch. Congratulations, you've just been given a Darwin Award for taking yourself out of the gene pool early without contributing to the next generation. So I'm arguing that there was a natural selection for, an evolution of the propensity to make more type 1 errors than type 2 errors, more false positives than false negatives. That is, just assume that all Russells in the grass are dangerous predators just in case, because one is a much more costly error than the other. Now, why can't we just collect more data and get the decision right? Why can't we tell the difference between Russells in the grass and dangerous predators? Why not just sit there in the grass and collect more data? Let's see how it goes. Because that itself will turn you into lunch for a predator. Sitting there and stalling and waiting around is also a dangerous strategy to take. So our brains have evolved the propensity to make snap decisions, rash judgments, intuitive, instinctive choices, not based on evidence, not based on collecting lots of data, based on a very rapid cognition. And that's the propensity for believing all sorts of things. I call this patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless noise, whether it's the face of Jesus in a tortilla or the Virgin Mary on a grilled cheese sandwich. We have this tendency to see things, particularly faces, for example, everywhere we look. However, that's not such a bad thing because, in fact, we have to find all sorts of new patterns. That's called learning. Connecting A to B when A really is connected to B, that's called association learning, whether it's ringing the bell and giving the dog some food and he salivates, you ring the bell and give him some food, he salivates, you ring the bell, he salivates. That's association learning, classical conditioning. You've connected A to B, and it's a real connection for him, and the animal learns it. What happens in the brain is they actually strengthen or even grow new interneural connections between neurons. Memories are stored in these patterns of neurons firing. So the more you repeat something, the neural pattern gets reinforced over and over and over, and it strengthens. The synaptic connections are stronger. For example, they have more dopamine in them. There's a whole bunch of these neurochemical transmitter substances. Dopamine appears to be one of the ones that is deeply connected with learning and reinforcement. A reinforcement in learning theory is anything that causes the organism to repeat what it just did. So if you're a pigeon in a box, one of these Skinner boxes, and you give him little things of food whenever you want, he pecks keys or whatever it is you're trying to get him to do. If you just randomly assign him reinforcements, whatever the animal was doing just before he got the reinforcement, he'll repeat that. That's the very definition of a reinforcement. So let's say whether it's a rat touches the side or the pigeon's wing touches the wall or whatever, it turns around twice clockwise and once counterclockwise, and he gets a reinforcement. He's going to remember that and repeat it. Reinforcement, touch the left, go this way once and the other way half a way, and then I get the right. And that's called superstition. Sometimes we call it magical thinking, but superstitions are just connecting A to B when there is no connection. And if you think that's just a bird brain problem, just go out to the casinos out there, to the slot machines, and you'll see this operation at work. They have it perfectly programmed. They know exactly how much money they're going to make on the hour, every hour, 24/7, depending on how many people are sitting there. You can't win. But your brain is geared up to try to find some connection there. And if you do, you get a little hit of dopamine, a little positive boost. People that are susceptible to gambling addictions, they get a huge hit, probably of dopamine and maybe some other brain chemicals there that kind of cause them to get even more reinforcement than the rest of us get when they get a little hit from gambling, say. And particularly if they're less risk averse and they like doing those sorts of things, they get an extra little jolt. And we know this from brain research on this connecting these different causal explanations for patternicity. For example, subjects that are shown random patterns, dot patterns on a computer screen, or they're given random flashes of light or random noises in earphones, almost never see randomness. They always find a pattern of some sort. Again, our brains are designed or evolved to find meaningful patterns, whether they're really there or not. And it turns out that if you give subjects L-DOPA is given normally for Parkinson's patients to quell the tremors a little bit. It increases the amount of dopamine in the brain. They're more likely to see random patterns, meaningful patterns in random noise, than even the rest of us are without the little extra hit of dopamine. So dopamine appears to be one of these chemicals that's highly related to behavioral addictive addictions, plus just basic learning and this sort of process of patternicity. We know from split brain patient research that that patternicity tends to occur more on the more on the right hemisphere than the left hemisphere, showing patterns and tracking where it's recorded in the brain just by forcing that through split brain experiments. This process of finding new patterns happens more in the right hemisphere than the left hemisphere. Right hemisphere is often associated with artistic ability and musical ability and so on. So let's take a moment and think about this. It's not that patternicity is a bad thing. We skeptics tend to kind of make fun of people that see the Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich, which, by the way, sold for $28,500 to a Las Vegas casino. Well, since we're here in Las Vegas, that seems appropriate. And we have a good chuckle about that. People believe this. But in fact, this is the basis of all creativity. It's making a new scientific discovery, creating a new genre in art or music. It's finding a pattern and seeing a pattern or discovering a pattern that no one else has ever seen or done before. That's a good thing. So the tension here is to keep an open mind so that you are creative and you can see something new or accept a radical new theory, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out and you think everything is real. And so I have a discussion in the Believing Brain on the relationship between creativity and madness. And there's a pretty good database now. Thousands of creative people have been studied. And they have a disproportionate amount of manic depression and schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, either directly themselves or in their immediate family. These are largely genetically programmed diseases, we think. They get passed along genetically. So what's going on here is that if you are so creative, you're able to find new patterns that no one else could see. Perhaps you also find patterns that are not real. So my favorite example that I use in the book is contrasting Richard Feynman and John Nash. Richard Feynman won the Nobel Prize in physics for his work in quantum physics, quantum mechanics, specifically quantum electrodynamics, of how these subatomic particles interact with each other. And he invented, as it were, Feynman diagrams. There's these diagrams of how these subatomic particles interact with each other. They collide and interact and then go apart. And these are called Feynman diagrams. He sketches them out and then adds mathematical equations to them. So powerful, these Feynman diagrams, that they're still used today by physicists to explain these complex interactions of subatomic particles. So popular were Feynman diagrams that he had Feynman diagrams drawn on the side of his 1976 Dodge cargo van, which he drove around Pasadena, California, where I'm from. In fact, Feynman lived up in Altadena, where I live. And as the story goes, one day he was driving up Lake Boulevard there, up from like where the Rose Parade is there, and somebody stopped him at a light, rolled down the window and said, "How come you have Feynman diagrams on your van?" He said, "Because I'm Feynman," which I thought that'd be a cool story to tell. It's possibly apocryphal, but if not, it's a great story. Feynman van is still around, by the way. It's in South Pasadena, parked in a garage. If you ever want to see Feynman diagrams, if you're a big physics fan, I'll take you there sometime. You come to LA. John Nash, by contrast, won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on game theory. He discovered the mathematical relationships between subjects in a contest of any kind. This might be a prisoner's dilemma kind of contest, or an ultimatum game, or it could even be corporations competing in a particular industry. It could be nations competing in a Cold War strategies. Nash equilibrium is a famous concept in game theory about how subjects reach a stable state of how they compete with one another. Whether it's companies in a particular industry, they kind of they're very competitive, but they end up kind of reaching a stabilized point where prices stabilize and the quality of product stabilizes for a while. Cold War strategies like mutual assured destruction is a type of Nash equilibrium where we reach a kind of a stable state for a while, where I'm not going to gain anything by changing my strategy, and neither will you, so we hit some stability there. But you may recall John Nash from the movie A Beautiful Mind, who also saw patterns that were not real, patterns of government cover-ups and conspiracies and cabals and secret agents and aliens talking to him and so on. This is played by Russell Crowe. John Nash was paranoid schizophrenic, but he's still alive. So if you see too many patterns that aren't real, then that's called madness. Well, course, madness has many causes. I'm not just claiming it's another version of patternicity. But it's the process of finding patterns that are not real may also lead you to be a creative genius. And as Nash describes it in the book version anyway, the movie's a little different than the book. In the book, in reality, his hallucinations were mostly auditory. That's the case for most schizophrenics, more auditory hallucination. Hard to make a movie with auditory. You have to have more visual. But as he describes in the book, that why do you believe in aliens are talking to you, or secret government agents are speaking to you? He says, because it's the same voice that I get, they're the same source. It feels like the same source that I get my mathematical ideas from. So without a tool, some way of discriminating between true and false patterns, how are any of us to know if we've made an important discovery or if we're just crazy? Right? So the answer is science. Science gives us a systematic, reliable method at getting at what's real and what's not. It's not foolproof, it's not perfect, but it's the best source we have. This is why science has developed all these particular tools for understanding how the world works, like having your experiment blinded. You have to blind the experiment, because if the subject knows which condition they're in, they'll change their behavior, or they'll act differently. So if you're testing some particular drug, if the patient knows he's got the drug for weight loss or whatever, he's likely to change his behavior in multifariate ways that are not related to the drug. And then when you get whatever effect you get, you don't know if it's caused by the drug, or if he changed his diet, he sleeps more, he exercises better, did this, that, and the other. And maybe that's the cause of the effect you're measuring. It also has to be double-blinded, because if the experimenter knows which condition the subject is in, the experimenter may record the data incorrectly. There's quite a bit of good research on experimenter bias. It's a big problem in science. Why is this happening? Because of something called the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is where you look for and find confirming evidence for what you already believe, and you ignore the disconfirming evidence. You remember the hits, you forget the misses. Everybody does it. It's applicable to all of our beliefs, our political beliefs, our economic ideologies, our social attitudes, our religious faith and beliefs, even our scientific theories and hypotheses. We all employ the confirmation bias. It's the mother of all cognitive biases. It's so powerful, it's hard to get around it. And this is why science has all these checks and balances to try to avoid this problem. So, for example, if you're conservative, you probably read the Wall Street Journal, you listen to conservative talk radio, and you filter the world through that. You only mostly hear the data and evidence to support whatever the particular conservative topic is of the day. Unlikely that you're listening to progressive talk radio or reading the New York Times, which is what liberals do. Well, I guess nobody really listens to progressive talk radio anymore. NPR, maybe. Anyway, you filter your sources, and you surround yourself with people who are your fellow conservatives, like here we are, well, libertarians, whatever we are. Or you surround yourself with liberals, and everything gets filtered through that. Because we're so tribal, we also feel good about this, like we're right and they're wrong. It's not that we're right, we're morally right, we're better than them. And everybody does this, including scientists. Every scientist would love his pet theory to be true. This is how you advance your career. This is how you get grants. This is how you move up the academic ladder. It's how you get raises and so on. You've made an important discovery. And so, of course, scientists are going to be hugely subject to the confirmation bias. So I guess we'll talk about this afternoon with Bjorn Lomborg and I about bias in science. It's a problem, but it's a bigger problem in all other areas of life. Religion, politics, economics, social attitudes, because at least science has a systematic way of getting at the truth, with a small t, and trying to avoid those kinds of cognitive biases. It's not perfect, but if you don't look for your disconfirming evidence, I can assure you somebody else will. Usually with great glee in a public forum, they will debunk your silly ideas and gain their own status and recognition, advance their careers by debunking somebody else's silly theory. I think libertarians would like this and conservatives, because they recognize the value of competition. Competition is good. Competition is what drives us forward. Innovation and so on. Science is a very competitive enterprise. There's only so many grants, and limited academic jobs and so on. There's only so many people that can be published in the big journals. It's very competitive. This is a good thing, because I don't really understand quantum physics and string theory and and global general relativity and a lot of these really complex physical sciences in particular. But I have some confidence that somebody else does, and they keep each other in check. That is to say, the system itself is kind of self-policing. Somebody's watching each other because they're very competitive. And it's not like they're going to meet on the weekends to get their story straight because, you know, those creationists, they're trying to do this political. No. If you ever go to a scientific conference, you see how sort of invigoratingly competitive it is. They challenge each other constantly, and there's a lot of backstabbing and behind-the-scenes machinations about whose theory is right and who has the most support and all that. So when I'm not sure about something, like for Skeptic Magazine, people send me pretty much every week some new theory about this, that, or the other. And most of them are obviously just silly bunk of some guy just in his garage saying, well, Newton was wrong, and Einstein was wrong, and Feynman was wrong, and I figured it out, and I don't really know the math yet, but maybe you can work on this. I don't do the math either, sorry. Now, usually I don't do anything with these other than file them away in my theories of everything drawer. But occasionally I'll get something that's interesting, and so I'll send it to my friends at Caltech and go, so what if this guy is wrong? Why is he wrong? I want to give him a fair answer. You know, so they'll tell me, well, so because of this and that and the other. If I ask, well, so what's the status of string theory? I'm just curious about this because it seems like they don't have any empirical data yet. So I'll go to my friends at Caltech or at Berkeley or MIT or whatever, and I'll get 3 or 4 voices that go, well, here's where the field is right now. We have no data, that's true. But it's in principle testable, and so it's not quite a hardcore science status yet, but we're getting there and this, that. And I know I can sense that they kind of keep track of each other. And then, like 2 years ago, there was 2 books published, you know, basically debunking string theory, saying string theory is not even a science, by the guys in the field themselves. So I thought, okay, this is good. This means it's a healthy, the science is healthy, right? So that competitive nature of science is what keeps us on track. Not perfectly. There's still a lot of things that are published that are just complete bunk, nonsense, like the Wakefield paper that was published in The Lancet, allegedly connecting vaccinations to autism. This was utter rubbish. This is probably the poorest paper ever published in the history of medicine. And somehow it got through peer review, and there it was, boom. And it caused this huge mass panic, and you know, thousands and thousands of parents not vaccinating their kids because of this fear. There's not a shred of evidence to it. It's complete bunk. And yet it got legs because we just tend to believe anything we hear or read or see. It was in The Lancet. Must be true. Unfortunately, when the debunking articles are published, they don't always get as much attention in the media. The big splashy stories get the attention. The debunking stories, the follow-up studies that could find no replication process, we could not duplicate it, they don't get a big thing. Pons and Fleischmann and cold fusion, 1989, got all that press, media attention, you know, free energy, too cheap to meter, cold fusion's the answer to the future. And then within about 2 months, this was thoroughly, completely debunked. Not a single lab anywhere in the world could replicate their findings, end of story. But that wasn't the end of the media story, of course, because they don't follow up on that, saying, hey, guess what? 20 different labs could not find the same results. Right? So that's part of the problem we face is how the data, how scientific findings are presented. Now, when let's go back to our thought experiment on the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago. You hear a rustle in the grass. Is it a dangerous predator or is it just the wind? What's the difference between the wind and a dangerous predator? The wind is an inanimate force. A dangerous predator is an intentional agent. And there's a big difference there. That is, our brains tend to infuse the patterns we find with an intentional agency. We think that there's something hidden there, a force, not just an inanimate force, but a force with some kind of essence or being to it. A dangerous predator intends to eat me, and that can't be good. So we also add a value judgment to it. I call this agenticity, the tendency to infuse patterns with intentional agency. This is the basis of the belief in animism and spiritism and ghosts, and poltergeists, and demons and angels and aliens and hidden cabals and conspiracies and gods and God and so forth, the afterlife. It's all part of this fact that we're natural-born dualists. And we tend to think that there's 2 substances, corporeal and incorporeal, body and soul, brain and mind, as if there's 2 different things. Now, I argue in the believing brain there's only one thing. It's just material stuff, that's it. The mind is just a word we use in a fuzzy way to describe what it is the brain is doing when it's doing its thing, which is neurons firing, swapping dopamine and other chemicals. But I'm in the minority position on that. Most people are natural-born dualists. Most of us, most of the time, think there's two things. That's why we can watch a fun movie like Freaky Friday and get the humor of Lindsay Lohan and Jamie Lee Curtis switching bodies. But if you think about it, what's switching? What's going from one thing to the other? In our minds, we think, well, it's like their soul maybe, or their personality, and now you got a middle-aged mom in high school talking to the girls about boys, and you got the teenage girl who's in the corporate boardroom, and she's ha-ha, and laughter ensues. And these make for funny movies. There's a bunch of these, Big, where you change ages, or 13 going on 30, where, something goes from one body to the other. What is that? What is that thing? Well, we naturally just think, well, I got it. It's the spirit, the personality. Somehow it's not encoded here. It's out there somewhere, just temporarily and housed in the body, and it floats around. This is, of course, the basis of belief in the afterlife. And it's a natural belief. I'm claiming that we evolved that propensity as well as part of this evolutionary process. And you can ask subjects in the experiments, would you wear Hitler's sweater? And most people go, oh, no, it's got evil in it. It's, ugh. I mean, unless you're one of these neo-Nazis that likes to collect Nazi memorabilia off eBay because it's fun. Most people would not wear Hitler's sweater. But if you ask them, would you wear Mr. Rogers' cardigan sweater? Oh, yes, that would be nice. I'd feel more moral and upstanding, as if the essence of goodness or evilness exists without a person. Like it's just floating, like out in the ether somewhere, and it got in the sweater, and it's in the sweater. Another one of these experiments was to put Brad Pitt's sweater for sale on eBay. Washed versus unwashed. Which one do you think got the higher price? Unwashed, of course. I want the essence of Brad Pittness, just to... So why would this be? This may actually have an evolutionary basis to it. I argue in The Believing Brain that, in fact, the sense of smell is really important for certain parts of our lives that are important. For example, the sense of disgust. Things that smell really bad trigger a sense of disgust. And most of the things that we're disgusted about that smell bad are related to communicable diseases of things that you probably should not be getting too close to. Bodily excrements and things like this that carry diseases. On the positive side, things that smell good, roses or very pleasant scents, or the famous T-shirt experiment where subjects smelled the T-shirt of somebody of the opposite sex and they preferred one kind of smell to another, and that turned out to be related to who would actually make a good genetic match for them. And just subjective anecdotes about people who love the smell of their lovers or spouse's clothing, and that there's sort of almost like an essence to it. Like the essence of my lover is in the clothing. And that may then, so that projection, that dualistic projection, like there's an essence that exists, may actually have a basis in physical reality. That, in fact, that's the smell stuff is important to us from an evolutionary perspective. But our brains are definitely wired up to do this. You can stimulate parts of the temporal lobes, which are located just above your ears. And you can trigger all sorts of sort of spiritualistic type experiences. People hear voices of angels or God speaking to them. They have a sort of sense of connectedness to the universe. If you go probe deeper through the temporal lobes into the limbic system in the brain where emotions are controlled, they often have deep religious experiences. These experiments, by the way, are often done with epileptic patients who are getting their corpus callosum cut between the two hemispheres to stop the seizures from spreading from one hemisphere to the other. Remember, we have two brains in our head, not one. And so if you cut it, then the seizures can't spread. Well, before they go under, you ask them to sign a waiver and say, is it okay if we poke around and wake you up in the middle of the surgery and ask you what's going on while we poke around? And amazingly, they say yes. And this is how much of this brain mapping data has been gathered over the last half century. So we know a lot of what happens where in the brain. And we know these kinds of experiences happen under all sorts of different conditions. There's a sense-presence effect, for example, that can be triggered any number of ways. sense that there's somebody else here in the room, maybe right next to me. Lindbergh described this in The Spirit of St. Louis, how after only 36 hours of sleep deprivation, which is nothing, I mean, every graduate student's had that, that there was angelic beings in the cabin of the plane with him that he spoke to, and they spoke back to him. The Himalayan climbers, the guys that do K2 and Everest, they'll often report, especially when they're alone, that there's somebody else on the rope with them that they're talking to and that talk to them. So this might be oxygen deprivation, might be cold. But on the other hand, solo sailors and Arctic explorers who are basically at sea level, and maybe not even cold, maybe they're in the South Pacific, and they often report there's somebody else with them. These people that try to like go around the world in a sailboat by themselves, they'll often report sensing somebody else with them. The Iditarod, dog sledders, a significant percentage of them have all had sleep-deprived, fantastic hallucinations of beings sitting there on the sled talking to them, and they talk back to them. I've had some of these experiences when I was a transcontinental bike racer of going hours and hours, days without sleep, and all sorts of weird hallucinations. The brain is just capable of doing this under all sorts of conditions. Projecting out from ourselves something else that's not material. Now, I argue that this is entirely in the brain, 100%. It's a product of our neurons firing and nothing else. But again, I'm in the minority position there. My friend Deepak Chopra would argue that, in fact, it's just the software running on the hardware. The software exists out there in the matrix somewhere. Well, I'm not going to adjudicate that debate here, but I argue that, in fact, as the brain dies from, say, tumors or brain damage, injury, especially from, like, say, senility and dementia and Alzheimer's, as the neurons die cell by cell, the memories and the personality of the person fade away, just gone. Where did it go? I claim it goes nowhere because it's stored there in the system. So the only way to achieve immortality would be through better science and technology. Download those neural patterns into some substrate that can be carried on into the far future because it's a better substrate than the electric meat of our protein, which doesn't last very long. Okay, well, this is kind of science fiction, Ray Kurzweil kind of stuff. I enjoy that a lot. We're not there yet. Unfortunately, I think all this is going to happen right after I die, and I'm going to be so upset if these guys achieve immortality just after I'm gone. I'm going to come back and haunt them. No. I do think this is the basis in the belief in the afterlife and God and so on. I'm not a believer myself. So maybe I'm biased. Maybe you shouldn't believe the skeptic. And the answer is, that's right, you shouldn't. This is the problem. Of course, I'm as subject to the confirmation bias as anybody else. I'm a libertarian, so I read Reason Magazine and all the Cato Institute stuff, and I filter it all through there. And I don't ever listen to progressive talk radio. I can hardly stand it. The New York Times is so obviously biased. The Wall Street Journal is so obviously fair and balanced. But I can't help but think, you know what, maybe I'm subject to my own biases, right? So sometimes it's good to read the other side and talk to those liberals if you must. No, just kidding. And because I would actually love to see a presidential debate coming up here for 2012 in which they actually have to take the other guy's side. Just for 5 minutes, you defend that particular issue, whether it's abortion or gun control, whatever it is. Just to see what that would be like. But also what it does is it forces you to think, oh yeah, these guys actually do have good arguments, and they do have good data. Everybody's got data. So how do we adjudicate the issue, right? Well, in politics, we do it through elections. In science, we do it in a slightly different way. There is something of a consensus that goes on in science. It's a little bit of a democracy, in a way, because there's a community of experts who all attend the same conferences and whatever, and they talk amongst themselves. Again, they're very competitive, so that's a good thing. But they have, with their checks and balances. And this is why I would argue that, in fact, the American experiment is a kind of scientific experiment. That is, when the founders set up our country, they said, look, we don't know how to run a country. Nobody does. So we have to set it up in a way that is like an experiment. Well, we'll run it for a while, and then we'll change the conditions and variables, and we'll tweak those, and then we'll run it for a while longer and see how it goes. These are called elections. You're going to throw the bums out and bring some new bums in and let them try this and that, and then we'll collect the data and see how that goes, and And that is, in a way, how science works. I'd argue it's probably a little more cumulatively progressive than, say, politics. But on the other hand, things are better, I think measurably, objectively better now than they were, say, 500 years ago, in terms of like the number of people who have freedom and prosperity around the world. There were 0 liberal democracies in 1900, not one. Even America wasn't a liberal democracy. Women couldn't even vote till 1920. And now there's, something like 120, 130, something liberal democracies around the world. We're making progress. You can measurably, objectively, scientifically measure the difference between a dictatorship and a democracy by looking at North Korea versus South Korea. You can see it on a map at night of the lights. You can see it in the height of North Koreans versus South Koreans. They're about 4 inches shorter. You can measure it in their GDP, which is an order of magnitude smaller in North Korea versus South Korea, and so on. These, I claim, actually are, scientists are not supposed to pretend politics is a science, but I think that's wrong. I think we can cross that barrier and say, look, there are some measurable, objective scientific arguments we can make. And that the American experiment, in fact, was set up by a bunch of scientists. Franklin and Payne and Jefferson, these guys were natural scientists. That word wasn't even used until the late 1800s. It wasn't even invented until like 1845. So of course they didn't call themselves scientists. They were philosophers, natural philosophers. But that is what we mean today by science. So in a way, they're running a scientific experiment. And so since I'm at a venue that talks a lot about politics, I think that's a good way to think of it, is that let's run some experiments. Let's try this tax system or that set of laws, and we'll see how it goes and collect the data. And let's think of it that way. Let's think of ourselves as scientists and always look for that disconfirming evidence. Okay, I will end with reading the last 2 paragraphs of my book, and then we'll take a few questions. So here I'm just kind of wrapping up about the power of science and belief. And of the many mysteries we have uncovered and questions we've tried to answer, one in particular stands out. Homo rationalis, that species of human who carefully weighs all decisions through cold, hard logic and rational analysis of the data, is not only extinct, but probably never existed. Mr. Spock is science fiction. And it's a good thing, because people who have suffered brain damage to the emotional networks in their brains, particularly their limbic systems, find it nearly impossible to make even the simplest of decisions about the most mundane choices in life, which toothpaste to buy, for example. With so many brands and sizes and qualities and prices to consider, reason alone will leave you standing there in the store aisle, frozen in indecision, analysis paralysis. An emotional leap of faith beyond reason is often required just to go through the day, let alone make the big decisions in life. In the end, all of us are trying to make sense of the world, and nature has gifted us with a double-edged sword that cuts for and against. On one edge, our brains are the most complex and sophisticated information processing machines in the universe, capable of understanding not only the universe itself, but the process of understanding. On the other edge, by the very same process of forming beliefs about the universe and ourselves, we are also more capable than any other species of self-deception and illusion, of fooling ourselves even while we are trying to avoid being fooled by nature. In the end, I want to believe, but I also want to know. The truth is out there, and although it may be difficult to find, science is the best tool we have for uncovering it. Thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yep, there we go.
So understanding the brain, as you've walked through here today, how can you weave yourself into the brain of a liberal to tap, which you need to tap to provide them light?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, probably not the Ann Coulter approach where you call them idiots. I mean, that's kind of a conversation stopper for most people. Because, of course, liberals don't, I mean, it's like I deal a lot with pseudoscience, and who we call pseudoscientists. But, of course, nobody thinks they're pseudoscientists. They don't think, oh, I'm going to my pseudo lab today to collect some pseudo facts to defend my pseudoscientific silly theory. Nobody thinks that. Of course, liberals don't think that either. So one approach, I think the value of being a libertarian is that we're fiscally conservative, socially liberal. You can find some common ground and then shift them over. You know, the same principle you see here actually applies over here. If you're for freedom, then you should be for freedom not only in this area, but in this area over here, and you just try to nudge them that way. Oh, now, part of the problem that we run into here, that I discuss in my chapter on politics and the believing brain, is that liberals and conservatives tend to emphasize different moral values, and it's not that one of them is better than the other. It's like, well, I believe in helping the poor, and that it's government's job to take care of the needy and so on, man the soup kitchens and all this, and the people that fall through the cracks, and conservatives want to emphasize, say, group value, the rule of law, patriotism, and so on. And it's like, well, how are these related? Well, so you have to find some common ground. Like, well, I believe we should take care of the poor too. I'm my brother's keeper. Yes, of course. We're a group together. We got a band together and help each other. The only question is, what's the best way to do this? I mean, is really government the best way to do this? Think about this. Religion's actually pretty good at this. This is where I run into some trouble with my atheist friends down the roadway at the other conference I'm at. It's like, oh no, religion. Yeah, religion does a lot of good things, actually. They man the soup kitchens. They go to New Orleans after Katrina, and they're way better than FEMA. And that's actually a good example, because people go, oh yeah, FEMA. Oh God, that was a disaster. Right. So really, is government the best way to help people? And then you kind of nudge them that way.
Hi. Would you say, like, in the skeptic movement, what is the most pervasive and most dangerous bias that you see?
Within the skeptics movement?
Yeah,
I think skeptics have a strong bias against religion. Just a knee-jerk, if it's religious, it's got to be bad. And they have very little subtlety in looking at that. The liberal bias is probably the other biggest one. That, like, if you do a show of hands like I do every year down at the amazing meeting is at South Point Hotel this same weekend, it's probably 85% liberal, 14.999% libertarian, and 0.00001% conservative. Like, there's one guy at the back. Yeah, I am. And so, why is that? Well, because scientists, we're all pro-science. We love science, and scientists are almost all academics. And academics are pretty much liberal. So they've just been inculcated in the liberal worldview because academia is so biased that way. I'm sure you've seen these studies. Places like Berkeley, you won't find a single conservative, a Republican, in any of the social sciences or humanities. I mean, like, not one. And when I challenge them on this, it's like, how can you think that you're giving students a balanced education when all they get is this liberal perspective? And their answer is, well, because we're actually right, and we're helping counter what they're going to get out there in the real world. It's like, that's not helping anybody. Anyway, so I think that those two things, against religion and pro-liberalism, is too strong.
Thank you.
Yeah, about science, I wonder if you could comment on the climate science, debacles we've seen recently.
I thought that might come up today. And I think I'll save most of my comments for when I'm on with Bjorn Lomborg this afternoon. I think it's at 5, Bjorn and I, or 4:30, something like that, about bias in science. I'm sure this will come up. Yes, of course, I think obviously climate science is no less biased than any other science that's related to a political or economic or social issue, which is to say most of the social sciences have the same problem. So it's not just climate science. This is a particular issue for people that are into economics like us, because it has political, economic ramifications of public policy. But all the social sciences have the same bias. But I'm no longer a climate scientist on one level. I think of it as five different questions. Is the Earth getting warmer? Yeah. Is it human caused? Probably some of it, if not most of it. From there, I kind of start to get off the sort of climate bandwagon. How much warmer is it going to get? Well, when? 10 years from now, 50, 500 years from now. The further out you go on the time horizon, the error bars widen. And that makes predictions harder. And therefore, what will the consequences be of it getting warmer? It depends. If it's 0.5 degree centigrade, not so much. If it's 3 or 4 or 5 degrees centigrade, probably more. But even that, as Bjorn likes to point out, that, well, where? Africa, maybe not so good. Canada, maybe much better. So it's a complicated issue. And then 5, what should we do about it? Well, there I'm pretty much down the libertarian barrel there of letting market forces operate. If you want to get people to drive better cars, top-down government fiat controls are not going to do the trick. But if the price of gas goes up, boy, boom, people will start If there's a market incentive, particularly for inventors, for innovating better batteries, for example, like the Nissan Leaf or some of these, they're getting better. We have a ways to go. I'm not quite sure what the battery problem is. I live in LA, so a 100-mile range is problematic for much of driving in Los Angeles without constant plug-in stations, and that takes too long. But I think market forces will help us get there.
Thank you for coming. Could you describe how it takes longer to reject false claims than to accept true ones, and its well, I said that backwards. How it takes longer to reject false claims,
yes, that's right,
than to accept true ones.
I think, yeah, you got it correct.
Okay.
That,
and its implications for policy.
Yes, the brain research shows that, in fact, if you scan subjects' brains in an MRI scanner while they're pushing buttons to decide if they believe something or not, the process of believing something, like just pushing the button, yeah, I think that's true, I think that's false, I'm not sure. The I think that's true happens much faster. The cognitive processing in the brain happens much faster than the I'm not sure and I'm doubting it. That takes longer. And by the way, doubting something, parts of that limbic system associated with disgust, that negative emotion I talked about, also lights up. So being a skeptic is an unpleasant, uncomfortable, slower process. Why? Well, first of all, it's to tell the difference between the true and false things, you have to keep track of both. It's like lying takes more cognitive processing, why these new cognitive lie detectors are trying to do brain scan measures, because when you're telling the truth, you only have to remember one thing. I was there with my friend, but if you're lying, you have to remember the story you told and then what actually happened, and that just takes more processing. So those lie detectors, by the way, are not reliable yet, but that's kind of the principle, is that doubting something takes more processing, and that's a measurable thing. What it has to do with public policy is, well, because most people don't vote. When they vote, they're not voting based on reason or rationality or who has the better arguments. None of us do that. We vote tribally. I'm voting my tribe, that's it. Now I'm encouraged by Matt Welch and Nick Gillespie's new book, The Rise of the Independents. This is the biggest voting bloc now. We're getting there. It's a little bit like herding cats. Come on, let's all circle the way. We're our own tribe, the non-believer tribe. It's the same problem with skeptics. The nuns is the biggest growing religious group in America. N-O-N-E-S, nun. People that tick nun. Right? But it's hard to organize them into anything. It's the problem with libertarians. We're not well organized. But here we are. So it's possible. So in terms of policy, that's it. Let's take one more question.
This thing about conspiracy theories, which... is it true that in the Middle East, people tend to believe rumors and conspiracy theories more, and is there like a political or historical basis for that?
Yes, they do. I mean, if we think conspiracy theories are big here, they're huge in the Middle East. Well, because there's less education, there's less critical thinking taught, it's more of a theocracy than democracy, and so on, these countries. So that's part of it. Although I'm constantly amazed at what people believe in America. I mean, I was on my book tour just after Jesse Ventura was touring with his book, The 63 Documents They Don't Want You to Read, Well, they're on the internet for free. I mean, come on. And, I mean, Jesse's never met a conspiracy he didn't like. Okay, this is the problem. If everything's a conspiracy, then nothing's a conspiracy. I mean, some things must be conspiratorial by definition. And so I tend to be skeptical of the big conspiracy theories. If it involves world domination by 12 guys in a room called the Illuminati, it's probably not true, right? Watergate was a conspiracy. Yeah, okay, that makes sense, right? Lincoln was assassinated by a conspiracy. JFK probably not. I mean, almost certainly not, in my opinion. Although I did have a moment of pause. I have to tell you, watching that HBO film Too Big to Fail, based on the book Too Big to Fail. And there's that scene in the movie, well described in the book, in September of '08, when Paulson and Bernanke call in the top 10 bankers, the Citibank CEO and the Bank of America guys, and so on. And it's 12 guys in a room, and they're basically saying, okay, look, we control like 70% of the world's finances, and if we don't fix this problem, we're not going to have an economy on Monday. I thought, holy crap, it's 12 guys in a room running the world. Maybe I'm wrong. So as a libertarian, I have to say that it's not just government that makes me nervous. Also, these kinds of huge power, any kind of power block in which people are doing things in closed rooms that I don't know about, that does make me nervous. So it does make me wonder, maybe we need some controls over some parts of the economy, because sometimes people can pull off conspiracies. Not often, though. I tend to be skeptical, but just in case. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate that.
This event was part of Freedom Fest, a libertarian conference held annually in Las Vegas. To find out more, visit freedomfest.com.
Get the Blogtv schedule.
A rustle in the grass. Is it a dangerous predator, or is it just the wind? Well, if you assume that it's a dangerous predator, and it turns out it's just the wind, you've made a type 1 error in cognition, a false positive. You connected A to B, but A is not really connected to B. It's just an accidental correlation there. There's no causal connection. But that's not a particularly high-cost error to make. Lots of animals make them. You just become more skittish and cautious, and you move around the noise. And you've all seen how animals are like that in these fur, fin, and feather shows on the Science Channel, Nature Channel, History Channel, Learning Channel, and so on, where they're super skittish, particularly preyed upon animals. On the other hand, and the reason for that is because, on the other hand, if you assume the rustle in the grass is just the wind, and it turns out it's a dangerous predator, you're lunch. Congratulations, you've just been given a Darwin Award for taking yourself out of the gene pool early without contributing to the next generation. So I'm arguing that there was a natural selection for, an evolution of the propensity to make more type 1 errors than type 2 errors, more false positives than false negatives. That is, just assume that all rustles in the grass are dangerous predators just in case, because one is a much more costly error than the other. Now, why can't we just collect more data and get the decision right? Why can't we tell the difference between rustles in the grass and dangerous predators? These are comedy shows, and so first and foremost, they tell the guest in the pre-interview, don't try to be funny. Leave that to the professionals. And I think that's actually good advice, because these guys really are funny. They're very fast. They're very facile and quick. And they have a team of 15 full-time comedy writers that sit there all day, every day, writing bits and lines that you would be foolish to try to compete with. And so, you know, it's just try to get your message across and get the point across. So that's what I did. So basically, the believing brain starts off with a thought experiment. So imagine you're a hominid on the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago, and your name is Lucy, you know, the little Lucy. Thank you for that. Not everybody always gets that little joke. It doesn't play well in the Midwest. 3.5 million years ago, the Earth was created 6,000 years ago. Right after the Babylonians invented beer. Yeah, that's about right. Anyway, so you're a hominid on the, actually that reminds me of that Gary Larson cartoon with the little Australopithecines in the cave party, and the guy's looking at the girl and going, "You're not the Lucy." It's kind of a funny bit. So you're a hominid on the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago, and you're in the age of science, and that's our best tool for understanding how the world works, which is where I'm going with this short talk, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after a little while when I tell you about the book. I should note that on Monday I did the Colbert Report, so I thought I'd just tell you a little moment about that, because people are constantly asking me what was it like to do the show. Is he always in character? Yes, he's always in character. Even the obligatory author, you know, guest host shot there, he's still in character. The show is filmed in New York. It's near where Jon Stewart's filmed. They're both comedy shows. These are the two most popular shows for authors to do. You will sell more books on either of these shows than you will on any other show except Oprah, but she's gone now. So, and in fact, the viewership from age 18 to 35 is greater than for Colbert or Stewart than it is for Jay Leno for that age group. In fact, there is something called the Colbert Bump. That they call the Colbert Bump for your book sales, and it's hard to track immediately with actual cash register ka-chings in bookstores, but on Amazon.com my book went from number 578 to number 19 in a matter of a couple hours after doing the show. So it actually works. Why not just sit there in the grass and collect more data? Let's see how it goes. because that itself will turn you into lunch for a predator. Sitting there and stalling and waiting around is also a dangerous strategy to take. So our brains have evolved the propensity to make snap decisions, rash judgments, intuitive, instinctive choices, not based on evidence, not based on collecting lots of data, based on a very rapid cognition. And that's the propensity for believing all sorts of things. I call this patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless noise, whether it's the face of Jesus in a tortilla or the Virgin Mary on a grilled cheese sandwich. We have this tendency to see things, particularly faces, for example, everywhere we look. However, that's not such a bad thing because, in fact, we have to find all sorts of new patterns. That's called learning. Connecting A to B when A really is connected to B, that's called association learning, whether it's ringing the bell and giving the dog some food and he salivates, you ring the bell and give him some food, he salivates, you ring the bell, he salivates. That's association learning, classical conditioning. You've connected A to B, and it's a real connection for him, and the animal learns it. What happens in the brain is they actually strengthen or even grow new interneural connections between neurons. Memories are stored in these patterns of neurons firing.
Freedom Fest 2011 with Michael Shermer. Mr. Shermer is the author of The Believing Brain, and he talks about how irrational beliefs are formed and reinforced. This is about 50 minutes.
Well, good morning. I am Michael Shermer, the director of the Skeptic Society and the publisher of Skeptic Magazine. I think we actually have a slide of that. There we go. We are the quarterly publication of the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization devoted to investigating claims of the paranormal, pseudoscience, fringe groups and cults and claims of all kinds between good science, junk science, bad science, voodoo science, pathological science, non-science, and plain old nonsense. Unless you've been abducted by aliens and been on Mars, you know there's a lot of it out there. Nonsense, that is. Some people call us debunkers, but let's face it, there's a lot of bunk. And somebody's got to debunk it, and that's part of our job. More interesting to me is why people believe bunk. That is, why people believe weird things, which was the title of my first book. And this, my 10th book, The Believing Brain, is interested in why people believe anything at all, not just weird things. So I would invite you all to go to skeptic.com and subscribe to Skeptic Magazine, join the society. We believe in not just a free, but also a rational society, a society based on science. We live